This story takes place in a quiet English town, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens. But on one hot day in late August 1867, a little girl walked into those nearby fields, and what happened next would horrify the entire nation, give birth to a famous phrase, and expose a monster hiding in plain sight. This is the real chilling story of the 80-year-old Fanny Adams, and so let's dive in. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon on August 24, 1867 in Alton, Hampshire. A small market town framed by hills, farms, and a quiet trickle of the riverway. 80-year-old Fanny Adams lived on a townhouse lane with her parents and her siblings. But that afternoon at around 1 p.m., Fanny went out with her little sister Lizzie and their friend Minnie Warner. Now their plan was very simple, wander through the nearby flood meadow, pick blackberries, and just enjoy the sun. Now, the people who saw them later said that the girls were just laughing and skipping as they made their way towards the hop fields, which is a place they had been to many, many times before. But somewhere between their home and those fields, someone else saw them too. As the girls walked along a dusty lane leading towards a meadow, they noticed this man trailing near them. He wasn't running, he wasn't rushing, he was just walking slowly behind them. Now, this man was by others described as well-dressed, quiet, and respectable looking, so not the sort of a figure that would immediately set off any alarm bells. But then something very strange happened, something that had never happened to those girls before. The man approached them very casually and got down to one of his knees so that they could speak at the same level. He then gave them this big smile, and in a very soft-spoken voice, he made them an offer. At first, the girls looked a little bit puzzled because this is not something that they were used to. But then the two of the children, Lizzie and Minnie, decided to accept this offer. So the man pulled out 3 halfpence and encouraged them to run off to spend it in the village together. But to Fanny, he made a very different offer. He said that she instead could have a halfpenny if she alone would accompany him up the hollow, which was this old road leading to the nearby village of Sheldon. Now, seeing that the other girls accepted their offer, Fanny also took the money. But because she actually remembered her mother saying, Fanny never go anywhere with strangers, especially alone, she actually refused to go with him. And that's exactly when everything changed. The man stopped smiling, he stood up, he then grabbed Fanny by her waist, he hoisted her over his shoulder, and began carrying her into the nearby hop field, completely out of sight of the other children. At around 5 p.m., having played out all afternoon, Lizzie and Minnie thought that it was time to return home. But when they were past that hop field, when they last saw Fanny, she wasn't there. So thinking, Fanny must have just left already, they too just went home, not really thinking much about it. And as they were walking back, they bumped into one of their neighbors, a woman called Mrs. Gardiner. Now, this was a very small village, so everyone pretty much knew everyone. And so Mrs. Gardiner saw the girls go out earlier that day, and so she asked, hey, where's your friend Fanny? And that's when the girls told her everything. They told her what happened earlier that afternoon. And so the horrified Mrs. Gardiner rushed to tell Mrs. Adams, and both women hurried up the lane to look for the small child. And amazingly, they actually met the same man, coming from the direction of the hollow. And so Mrs. Gardiner immediately stopped him and shouted at him, what have you done with the child? But the man just looked at her like, she was being all crazy. But he did manage to maintain his composure. And so he just said, nothing, I didn't do anything to her. Yes, he said he did give them money, but only to go and buy sweets, which apparently he did to children in the village all the time. But he also said that after Fanny got her halfpenny, she then left him and went on to rejoin the others. And so after reassuring the 2 women that he definitely never harmed Fanny, he went also to introduce himself as the clerk of a local solicitor, William Clement. And so, seeing that this guy was clearly a respectable man, they just allowed him to leave. However, what happened next would rewrite the history of the entire country. At 7 o'clock, Fanny was still nowhere to be found. So her worried mother put together a search party. Armed with lanterns, they began looking around the fields, they were combing through the hedgerows and calling out Fanny's name. But then a local labourer named Thomas Gates saw something dark lying ahead of him in the hop field. And when Gates went closer to it and shone his lantern over it, his face just went pale with utter horror. He just found poor Fanny's severed head. Immediately, Gates ran for help, and within minutes, a crowd surrounded the area. But nothing could prepare them for what else they would find throughout the meadow. The girl's body was dreadfully mutilated and scattered across the field. But this wasn't all. All the cuts were deliberate and very precise, meaning that this wasn't a crime of passion, and it definitely had not been an accident. Instead, it looked very calculated, very methodical, the work of someone controlled and deeply evil. And so suddenly, Alton was no longer a quiet town. It was a crime scene the likes of which Victorian England had never seen. Within hours, the authorities arrived. The investigation would be led by the Superintendent William Cheney and Inspector William Thornton. Now, after securing the area and removing Fanny's remains, the man began piecing together the witness accounts. As it would turn out, multiple people had seen the same man lingering near the hop field earlier that day, and a handful of adults also seen him walking alone in the same direction where Fanny disappeared. And so, armed with all of this evidence, the investigators decided to go question this man, because they actually had a pretty good idea who he was. But when they went to meet him, to their big surprise, the man actually never fled town. He didn't even go into hiding. Instead, he just went back straight to work. But this was nothing in comparison to what the police would find next. When they confronted him, his clothing began to tell a very clear story. His bottom parts of trousers, socks, and his boots were soaking wet. But the man just brushed it off and joked that surely this won't hang him, right? Because apparently he made the habit of walking through water whenever he was outside. Now, at first the investigators just looked at him like, this guy's got to be kidding, right? But they continued to search him anyway. And soon they would find something much more condemning. There were flecks of blood on his cuffs. His soaked boots also turned out to be heavily stained with blood. And then in his pockets, 2 small knives were found, and one of them was all bloodied. Now to this the man had actually no explanation for. But it was actually what the investigators would find in his office next that broke the case wide open. There, a small diary was lying out in the open. When Inspector Thornton, opened it and he began flicking through the pages, he got frozen on the spot as he landed on a page that contained only one line. 24th August. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. Now, the suspect did try claiming that the line didn't actually mean what it clearly suggested, because allegedly he had heard someone else say that they had actually killed a girl, and that he just simply noted it. But this statement made no sense, especially when you consider, that this man was practically drenched with blood, and he had a bloodied knife in his pocket, and so nobody believed him. But just to be sure, the investigators continued gathering all the evidence that they could find before they would ultimately reveal the man's true identity. And when the nation heard the truth, outrage erupted. After reviewing all the witness statements, the blood on his clothes, the knife in his pockets, and the disturbing diary entry, the authorities made an official arrest. A man named Frederick Baker. Baker was 29 years old, and he indeed worked as a solicitor's clerk in Alton. Now, on the outside, he really was this seemingly respectable man, because he was educated, he was articulate, and very polite. A man who was trusted and valued in the community. A man who could also approach children without any suspicion. But on the inside, there was a very different story to Baker. Not only did he remain absolutely calm during his questioning, but the investigators would also note that he was completely emotionless, almost like he was detached. Now, as for the evidence, well, it was pretty overwhelming. Considering what he did for a living, there was just no reason for him to have clothes and knives stained with blood. And on top of this, one of his colleagues, a man named Maurice Biddle, spoke of seeing him leaving the office at about 1 p.m. and then returning at around 3:25 p.m. He then went out again until about 5:30 p.m., and that's when Baker told Biddle about his encounter with Mrs. Adams and Mrs. Gardiner. Now, apparently Baker had seemed really disturbed by all of this, and even said that, it would be very awkward for him if the child was murdered. But that's not where it ended. The two men actually later went for a drink, where Baker mentioned that he might leave town the following Monday. Now, Biddle did begin wondering why, because, it might be really difficult for him to find a new job. But Baker made a reply that nobody would ever forget. I could go as a butcher. Shortly after all of this, the investigators would also find the murder weapon. It was actually discovered by a local painter named William Walker, who had found a large stone in the hop field, which still had some blood, long hair, and a small piece of flesh sticking to it. And this would be in line with what the Alton Divisional Police Surgeon Dr. Louis Leslie described in his post-mortem findings, that Fanny's death had been caused by a crushing blow to her head. Now, at his trial, not only did Baker claim that he was innocent, but he actually attempted an insanity plea. He said that he had no memory of the crime, and he then continued to go even further. He pointed out his family's predispositions. Apparently, his father threatened to assault and kill his children. His cousin had been admitted to asylums 4 times. His sister then died of brain fever, and Baker himself even attempted to take his own life after one of his love affairs went wrong. But the doctors, as well as the court and jury, disagreed, and so after a short 15-minute deliberation, Baker was found guilty of the murder and slaying of Fanny Adams. At 8 a.m. on Christmas Eve in 1867, before a crowd of more than 5,000 people, Frederick Baker was hanged. Apparently, before his execution, Baker had sent a letter to the Adams family expressing deep sorrow over the crime that he had committed. He said that he had been enraged at her crying, but that her death was without any pain or struggle. Baker really wanted their forgiveness, and so he also added that he never violated a child or made any attempts to ever do it. As for Fanny, she was buried in Alton Cemetery, where her headstone, which was actually renovated not so long ago, still stands today. But unfortunately, this is not where the sad story of Fanny Adams ends. Her name would soon become a part of a phrase, Sweet Fanny Adams, which at first might not sound so awful, but let me explain. In 1869, as part of their shipboard convenience food, the British sailors were served these new tins of meat. It contained mutton, and because apparently it tasted really bad, the man began saying that it surely must be the body of Fanny Adams they were actually eating. And soon that tin mutton was being called a tin of Fanny Adams. And to this day, the men in the British Navy are served rations nicknamed Fanny. Now, eventually, this slang phrase of Sweet Fanny Adams spread into the wider population and became the euphemism for nothing, worthless, or empty. But it is still used to this day, and most likely by you too. And that's because over time, the phrase has been shortened to Sweet FA, which of course now has an entirely different, more explicit meaning. But that still doesn't erase the fact that most people have no idea about the morbid origins behind it. And that behind this phrase was a real child, a girl who loved to laugh, play, and chase her sister through the fields. A girl who was taken by a monster disguised as an ordinary man. And so her story is very much a reminder that you cannot always spot evil straight away, and that you should definitely teach your kids to never trust any strangers out there, because you just simply can never know. Until next time.